Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Moore with the Missoula County Extension Office. Thanks for joining us again. We have some other things coming up this month, so we decided to do the filming for today. So thanks for watching us, and we're just going to talk about how to make your Thanksgiving a little less stressful. So we all enjoy holidays, but sometimes they just get to be a little too much. Holidays are based on tradition, but maybe it's time to change some traditions and kind of make them a little bit more to your liking, less preparation time, more family time. So I'm going to show you a few recipes today. I hope you'll enjoy those. The recipes will be online, so you can use those at your leisure. We always never know about food prices. We know they're up, and availability is always an issue too. I have read recently that turkey prices will be up, and we're not surprised about that, are we? And they should be available, but who knows? So maybe it's time to kind of switch some things up. You can still have turkey, but maybe to do it in different form. So one of the recipes today will be turkey meatloaf. And another recipe, which is one of my favorites, is a butternut squash lasagna. So that's a little bit of a switch from your usual turkey and mashed potatoes. These recipes can be used any time of the year, so I hope you will like them well enough to duplicate them at home. A lot of times we don't talk as much about the equipment that is good to have or to use to get the job done a little bit better. And then there are certain ingredients today that might not be as familiar with you. We're going to start out with our turkey meatloaf, and I'll bring that up to show you in a few minutes. Ground turkey is something that I use a lot of. In fact, I prefer to use that in a lot of recipes over beef, but that's just me. So it's usually used to be a little bit less expensive than beef. I'm not so sure anymore, but it's very versatile. It has a much lighter flavor. The calories are often a little bit less than beef because it's usually pretty lean. It's readily available, so that's why I use it a lot. This recipe calls for 5 pounds. However, that seems to be a lot. It makes a very large meatloaf. You can half the recipe easily. I've done that several times. So that's another option for sure. Some of the other ingredients that I wanted to talk about, I like to use, as you probably know by now, a lot of fresh herbs and a lot of fresh produce. I just feel like it tastes better, but there's certainly sometimes a frozen option. So we'll talk about that when I talk about the next recipe. So I've bought a little fresh thyme, and it always smells so great. You might have this growing in your yard, and of course we've had a freeze already, so hopefully you've brought it in. But usually you can get this any time of year, and it smells great, lasts a long time. And we'll use a little bit of rosemary in our next recipe. I'll talk more about that as well. Also, another product that is so helpful, because this recipe calls for a little bit of tomato paste. You can use the can for sure, but it's only like a tablespoon. So if you don't use a lot of tomato paste, then you're going to end up putting it in your fridge, and the next time you see it, it probably will have something growing on it. So you can freeze it, which is a good idea, or you can get a tube. That's what I like to use. This lasts a long time, and you squeeze it out, and it's just something I like to keep on hand. It has to be refrigerated, of course, like the other. Also, another important thing to use when you're doing any kind of meat is to have a good thermometer. So this thermometer is just one you just stick right into the meat itself. You don't leave it in there, because if you do, of course, it will melt and be ruined. So it's just to check and pull out your meat item out of the oven and stick it in and see where it should be. Since we're doing a turkey meatloaf, 160 is the temperature that it needs to be. at before you take it out. And because it is so much meat, as any meatloaf is, very dense, I usually try to check it several times. If you do a full recipe, this is an hour-and-a-half cooking time, which is why I had to cook it ahead of time, okay? So it's not a recipe that you want to have if you don't have much time. You can do it ahead, refrigerate it, and then take it back out. This recipe also calls for breadcrumbs, so you can make your own breadcrumbs, that's fine, but I typically buy just the plain breadcrumbs. So that's another important ingredient to have on hand. I use a lot of these. Let's see what else. We are going to make a roux. That's in our next recipe, so that's some of the things I have set aside. But in this recipe, it does call for a little bit of onion, and normally I put that in there. Sometimes I'm running a little bit low on onion, so I have this shallot. It's a lot milder flavor, so you might prefer to use all shallots instead of onions. So that's how you can kind of make your own substitutions a little bit. You could use the dried thyme as well, or you could add some other herbs. Dried herbs, a little Italian seasoning is good for that too. Don't be afraid to kind of substitute. So I suggest making the recipe as is once, and then the next time you can kind of do your own thing, all right? It also calls for chicken stock. You can make your own chicken stock or use the box or can variety, okay? This recipe is good. It tastes better even the second day. It's just something great to put on sandwiches as well. And if you're using it for a holiday, and some people here will get to taste this for sure. This is what it looks like. You can certainly put a sauce on there. So it actually fills up a platter quite nicely. Feeds a lot of people. A lot of people just get stuck with the old ketchup. That's good too. But you can put a nice mushroom sauce on there. I've done that before. Very inexpensive to decorate, and this will feed, I think, probably easily about 8 people if you do the entire recipe with a little bit left over. So it's a lot more compact looking, a lot lighter color, again, because it is turkey. So I'm anxious for you to try that and see what you think. This recipe is, you will see it a lot. It's actually from a cookbook I use quite a bit. It's an Ina Garten recipe, and so it's pretty famous. So I've used it many, many times, and everybody really seems to like it. Okay? So that, instead of a big turkey with a lot of bones, that's another option you can use. Much less expensive, for sure. Okay? So we're going to try that in just a little while. But before we do that, we're going to go over to the next recipe, and that's the butternut squash. So they go very well together. For that recipe, we again will use some herbs. We're going to use some rosemary. You can use dried rosemary too. Usually the dried rosemary has a stronger flavor. So I'll show you how I use this in a few minutes. But it's not the same amount for fresh as it is for dry, okay? So I'll talk more about that. The butternut squash, that's the one item. You can buy that, I think it's pretty much already cubed and ready to go if you get it from a local grocery store. I like to get the real butternut squash, and it's a little difficult to peel. That's the one thing. So I use this little gadget here. This comes in really handy. I meant to bring mine today. It got misplaced, but most people know what a butternut squash is. It has a very sweet flavor, and usually they come out in the fall. And one butternut squash makes, well, let's see, I had to use a pretty large size to get the 9.5 cups that this recipe called for, because this makes a lot. So you just cut it in small pieces, and you have to roast it. So roasting is cooking something at high heat in the oven, just kind of cover it with olive oil, salt and pepper, and just cook it at 425 to 450 till it gets to be brown, and then you take it out. So roasting is a great way to get a very fresh flavor for vegetables and maintain the flavor, the color, and as a really fast, easy way to prepare vegetables. So we are going to make the roux today because that's an important part of the recipe as well. So let's move this out of the way here. We're going to get this pan heated up a little bit. All right. And when you're making a roux, I usually always use butter just because that provides excellent flavor. I use olive oil for just about everything else, but some parts of the recipe, butter is better. So that's what we're going to do. And this calls for about 1/4 of a cup. Let's see. Well, I'm not going to put that in there quite yet because I just remembered we're going to have the recipe because this is just for demonstration. The other one, the real recipe takes a little bit of extra time, so that was prepared earlier. Okay. Got to watch your butter pretty closely so you don't burn it, because that would be the flavor we don't want to have in there. Okay. This also calls for some garlic, so this is a very large clove of garlic, but I'm going to put it all in there because it's nice to have that garlic flavor. Again, if you're not crazy about garlic, put a little shallot in there. That works as well. Okay. So I've got the cover off already, and I'm just going to smash it up, which is hard because it is such a big clove of garlic. Right. And this one calls for you to mince the garlic, so you want to have smaller pieces. So we're just going to slice it up. We will put that right in our melted butter, okay? Because if you were to add this after you've got the sauce already made, the garlic wouldn't have time to cook, and it would be still a little bit bitter. So we'll just cut up in pretty small pieces here. If you don't have that large of a chunk of garlic, use 2 smaller ones. That works too. Because I love garlic, so I like to put a lot in there. So when you can hear that butter sizzling, that's when it's going to be time to throw this in there. There you go. Sizzling, but not to the point that it's burning. That's what we want to be very careful about. Okay. We'll just go all the way here. We're also going to need a whisk for this because we are going to whisk in our flour and a little bit of salt and pepper and some milk for this as well. Okay. It doesn't specify what kind of milk to use. I like to use whole milk when I'm making a recipe, so just because I like to have all that extra flavor, a little higher fat content. So you can kind of see how that cooks pretty fast there. There you go. Okay. And the secret to a good roux that is just sticking with it and continually stirring. It is going to get thick, and at that point, that's when you know it's ready to go. Roux can cook for a long time because the darker they get, the more flavor they have, and that's good in a lot of recipes. This one, we don't need it to cook that long. If you've ever been to New Orleans or any place there are a lot of their traditional dishes that you use a roux. So, okay. This out of the way here. Yeah, it's kind of something you just can't step away from once you start. All right, starting to get a little darker in the bottom, and that's okay. Usually I don't add the salt and pepper at this point. I wait just a little bit. This recipe also calls for something called oven-ready lasagna. And it's not really easy to find this stuff. They're much smaller. I'll show you what size they come in the box. That's just what the recipe calls for, so I always try to find it. So they're smaller, they're easier to put in the pan and place in there. So it cuts down the time that you would have to boil water typically for the other kind of lasagna noodles. Okay, so that's a little bit brown there with the garlic. That's what we need right there. We're going to add, I have 3 tablespoons of flour. Add a little bit at a time here. So we're actually browning the flour in the butter and the garlic. I'm going to turn my heat down a little bit. I add all the flour at the same time. And this is just regular all-purpose flour. Okay. All right, so now that we've got that mixed in, I'm going to slowly pour in the milk. And stirring the whole time. Again, I'm just halving the recipe just for demonstration purposes here. You'd need a much bigger pan to have the full recipe. All right. Now, I'm not going to step away too far because it starts thickening up pretty fast. I'm going to put a little bit of pepper. And a little bit of salt. The butter is salted, so I don't want to add too much salt until, you can taste it later. Okay, there we go. All right. So back to the lasagna noodles. Since you don't have to boil water, that cuts down the time for preparation quite a bit. You do have to cook them in the oven, and it will give you directions as to how that works, how long that takes. They don't tend to shrivel up as much sometimes as the longer pieces. So if you can find, I usually get 3 or 4 boxes at a time because I use quite a bit of these. All right. Okay. Now once this starts getting a little thicker, we're going to actually, again, you can use dried rosemary. Just cut that out a little bit. But I like to use the fresh, and I'm just going to stick it in here and kind of let it soak in all that flavor and leave that rosemary flavor without a bunch of pieces of dried herb in there. Like I say, I want it to get thicker before I do that. This is kind of the same base if you're making gravy or anything like that. It's kind of the same procedure. Okay. Here, just turn it up a little bit more. So used to having a flame coming up, it's kind of always hard for me to get used to that. Okay. And then when it's done, we will stick it in here so it's a little bit easier to see. This is really important too, that you have all your ingredients out, because once it starts getting thicker, it goes fast. So you don't want to be looking around for things. And butternut squash recipe, it makes a lot, and it's great. It's always been one of the most popular things I've ever taken to places to be eaten. Once you read through the recipe, the whipped cream at the end, you whip the cream up with a little salt and cover the top. You'll see that when I take it out of the oven here. So that's kind of to keep the lasagna all flat, and it looks better, and I just taste better, I guess. Whipped cream on anything always tastes better. So this is not a low-calorie recipe, that's for sure. So just eat it for special occasions. Okay. You can say, oh, you feel like it's never going to get thicker, but eventually it just happens, and then that's it. You could also probably put a little bit of thyme in there. I haven't tried that before. I'll try that next time. But that would add nice complement to the rosemary too. If you were using unsalted butter, then this might be the time to kind of taste it and see if you needed to add more salt. Now that it's fall and you're kind of harvesting all your garden and all the vegetables, it's really fun to come up with a lot of recipes that you can use those. I always think that pumpkin might work well in this recipe. I haven't tried that yet, but I will do that at some point, just a pie pumpkin. So again, like I said, you need the milk for the sauce, and then you will need a little bit of heavy cream to do the whipping. Oh. And of course, the higher fat content in the cream, the better. It will whip and keep the form a lot better. This recipe has very little cheese in it, so it's not your typical lasagna. It has some Parmesan grated, but that's the only cheese, so, but you don't miss it at all. Oh, just because you like the taste of the squash. Okay, keep stirring that. I'm gonna take out the squash here. And it is a 9 by 13 pan. You'll need one of those. Okay. So when this does get thicker and you've had your squash all cubed up because it's roasted, ready to go, I usually let it cool off a little bit and then I just mix it right in with the sauce. So obviously I need a much bigger pan for sure. It doesn't have to be really thick because it's going to go back in the oven again. So it has another chance to kind of get a little bit more body to it. Okay, so I'm going to take the lid off, and this was made earlier today, so of course it looks a little shriveled on top. But it looks like it has cheese in there, but it doesn't. So it's just the color of the sauce. The noodles have pretty much kept their shape, which is what you like. It doesn't ever have to be perfect. And again, the whipped cream I put on the top kind of helps keep it down a little bit, and there's no sign of it being whipped cream. Plus, it adds flavor to the squash. Just a little bit more here. With a lot of things you cook, you think it's never going to happen, and then before you know it, it's too late. So it's a lot about timing. All right. Now, it doesn't look as thick as you think it would at this point, but like I said, we're going to leave it sitting out for a while and cool off. And when you're pouring it over 9 cups of squash, it soaks it up very quickly. Okay. All right. There's space here. Good. So, and at that point is when I will usually take a taste. Right there. And it definitely needs a little more salt. So, although you probably will salt and pepper the squash, but there we go. All right. And mix in a little bit more pepper. Okay. All right. Now, at this point, because it's still warm, you can do this either when it's still in the pan or at this point because it's very warm, and we're just going to let that soak in there for a little while. Okay, then you'll be surprised how that rosemary flavor just comes through. Right. And no matter how much I have made ahead of time, I still make a mess, don't I? Okay. All right. So again, we say if you have the butternut squash roasted and ready to go, you just pour this over or pour the roux sauce over the butternut squash, and then you just start making the layers. So there's a cup of the squash mixture on the bottom, because that's to hold the lasagna layers down so they're not laying on the bottom of the pan, because then they tend to overcook. Okay, so once you have that 1 cup down, then you just start layering like this, and you make sure they don't touch. So basically 3 more squash mixture, another 3 on top. Okay, and then more squash mixture, and then another 3, and that I have 1 left, so that's why I always use 2 boxes. Part of a whole one, do the whole box, and then 2 pieces out of another box. Okay, so that's why you want to buy as many as you can. Stick this back in there. All right, then I'm going to show you how we can cut that out of there and serve it. Oh, one thing I forgot to tell you, before you put the butternut squash, that's when I usually take this out of there, okay? And if you see any little pieces floating around. Oh, all right. So usually I can get about, let's see, this is about the serving size. And it cuts very easily, which is a good sign, because it means it is done. There we go. So it's a beautiful color because of the squash, so it's chock full of squash. That's how I love butternut squash, so like I say, it's one of my favorite recipes. In fact, I sometimes make this as a main dish. I like it so well. There we go. And you need no garnish on that because it's so beautiful the way it is. And it's kind of one of those things too, if you let it sit for another day and have it as a leftover, it tastes even better. So, yeah, easy garnish for that. If you want a little green on there, usually you like to put garnish on there that you know is in the recipe. There is no thyme in there, but because we have it, we can use that too as well, just to serve as kind of a garnish. So, so that are 2 of my favorite Thanksgiving recipes. Very inexpensive, very quick, and they serve a lot of people. So you can always bring out the ketchup too if you need to do that. So hopefully this will help you your Thanksgiving recipe journey, and I just encourage you to try these, and hopefully they'll become favorites of yours too. You can always visit me at the County Extension Office if you have any questions about cooking or food preservation, and I'm happy to answer those. So thanks to the library for hosting me today, and hope you have a great holiday. See you in December. December 13th we'll be live, so I hope you'll come join us and take part in the cooking yourself. So thank you.